county government was struggling with the fact that it was both property owner and regulator, had conflicting interests depending on, and regulations from different angles, different departments. So they were just not the ones to be the conveners. So it really kind of varies. There's both strategic and tactical questions. Sometimes doing them in-house with your own local people is really good. Sometimes you need an outsider, you know, a rock star outsider to come in and speak truth to power and make people mad who need to be made, you know, to say things that no local would say because they have to live there after, you know, afterwards. Like, guess what? That thing you just built on your riverfront is really ugly. And maybe you ought to rethink that whole riverfront plan. Not a good thing for that city to hear, but so I think it's really a case-by-case thing. But I've seen them funded and hosted and convened by a wide variety of agencies. I'm particularly fond, as I was mentioning to Ben earlier, of the work of the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. They're southeast Florida, Treasure Coast, north of Miami-Dade, south of Daytona, I think. They're based in Stewart. They do a lot of low-budget charrettes for communities that can't afford it. And they do really outstanding cutting-edge planning work. I refer to them as charrettes R Us because they do so many of them. And they do them very low budget. And they get volunteer help, and they coordinate it, and they just do extraordinary work. I've been fascinated by them for years. Sir, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to speak and see what happens here. It seems to me that there's like four units to this thing, which is developer, whoever that might be, decision makers, whoever that might be, the government or the financiers or whoever. There's the expertise, the architects, the engineers, the fire department, all that stuff. And then there's the residents. And I think that you've been talking about changing the minds of the residents a lot. But I'm wondering how this affects all the other parties. I mean, the developer has to, I mean, he'll have a fixed idea for whatever reason, finance, desire, capital, but perhaps it's, as this process goes on, you can see other ways to fulfill the requirements. And the government, or whoever the decision makers are, the planners, all these people, it seems that the process really needs to develop their expertise as well, not just the population of the people who live.
That's a really important point. I mean, and I think there's a huge education that goes on with developers in particular. Developers, because they have so much at stake very often financially, are, you know, typically they want to control. And they will typically try to make the charrette into what the critics often call a charade. Because, you know, it's like, it's really, they see it as an opportunity to sell what they're trying to do to the public. If you try to do that, you will, as a developer, get hung out to dry in the public hearings afterwards. People are too smart for that. They won't buy it. And I always tell them that if you feel after the charrette, you have to sell the plan to the participants, then you've failed. They should already feel like they own it at the end of the charrette. The other thing that developers will say is, well, I'm not going to turn my project over to the mob. What if they tell me to do something that's not financially feasible? I'm not going to go bankrupt because the neighbors told me I have to do this. So, well, the deal in the charrette is that the developer's interests and concerns have standing as well. In fact, ultimately, what you're trying to do as neighbors is you're trying to get the developer to realize that they could do something better. And very often it's the case that they can actually make more money by doing something that's better for the neighborhood. There have been many charrettes I've been in where developers have come in who have not been part of the plan, but happen to be sort of adjacent to it. And the design team sketched out a way that they could do something different than they'd already had permitted, amazingly. And they said, wow, that's cool. I could make a lot more money off of that, and then people would love me too. And they went and changed their whole plan at great expense. But there's a little learning that they have to go through to get to the point where they trust that process, because it does feel like you're throwing yourself to the wolves. You're throwing yourself to the, you know, that cartoon from The Simpsons. The neighbors show up angry, And they're kind of used to the idea that they have to subject themselves to that pain if there's a public hearing. They go in with their attorneys and they sit there and they take the abuse from people who accuse them of all kinds of sins. And then and many of the developers I've talked to have started out with good intentions and become cynical and quite unpleasant as a result of the nastiness of these public hearings. The ones who've become the shred supporters are the ones who learn from experience after getting hung out to dry in a few public meetings and having projects killed, go through a couple charrettes where the neighbors turn out to support it and realize that it's much more pleasant, and developers can be heroes. They're people who bring resources to a neighborhood, in the best of conditions. If you can enlist them to do things you want them to do, then that's cool. But if they come in and do the typical business as usual stuff that they might do anywhere, that's where it tends to be damaging. So in the process, you try to create a discussion whereby the developer has to be willing to be honest about where they stand and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. That's not going to work. But here's what will work for me. You can work your way to solutions in many cases. Some cases not. I mean, not everybody will be happy, but you're right that developers have to learn. City and county, public sector planners. Do we have any public sector planners in the room?
Yes.
Yeah. What a job. I mean, you take a beating from everybody. I continually hear people in the private sector trashing our public sector planners, and I point out to them, look what happens. They go in these public hearings and they get thrown under the bus by their elected officials who use them to score political points rhetorically. They get accused of things by the neighbors, ranging from incompetence to immorality. They get accused of all kinds of things by the developers who are being regulated by them. It's a very difficult process, and structurally difficult, because your job is at risk in a condition where typically you have too many bosses you go into these meetings, and maybe this is just peculiar to Florida, but I've worked a lot with city and county governments, and I sit in these meetings where the staff sit around and try to guess what this or that elected official might have meant when she nodded out during the discussion or made certain offhand comments, as if there was some underlying logic there that they could somehow hermeneutically derive. And it's like endless hours of meetings trying to interpret the secrets of the elected official's will. It's like, when why aren't they given a job to do and being allowed to do it? It's a very difficult space to function in. So I think sort of beating around this question, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, how do you create an organization within government that creates a space for planners to work effectively, to be allowed to participate and engage the community without being fearful that they would get out in front of the electeds or that they would raise too high expectations. You have to get to a point where the community can function without either getting too high expectations or it's a very difficult process. So I think there needs to be, this is my sort of proposal, the most successful planning departments are ones where there's a planning director who is structurally allowed to take a really powerful leadership role. Very often, arm in arm with some strong mayor or a planning director who has negotiated a job so that he or she feels like they have a real mandate to do a certain thing. And then that planning director is able to create an organizational space that protects staff from getting hammered and possibly fired, or at least feeling like their lives, their livelihood is at risk if they have an idea that's a little outside the usual. It's a very difficult organizational situation to work in, and I think there needs to be structural change in the organizations, and I think that possibly there needs to be some change in the way we educate people for the planning profession. Hope I haven't offended anybody.
We're living in a time and in a place now where our communities are increasingly polarized, and I'm amazed sometimes watching people argue against their own self-interest sometimes because rhetoric is so powerfully used. At the same time, we're living in a time that increasingly people are recognizing the value of crowdsourcing and really seeing that if you get a group of people together, you're going to get a lot of really good ideas. So I'm wondering, in your time that you've been doing this work, if you've seen much of the influence either of crowdsourcing or of that sort of political rhetoric that really gets people, you know, you're looking at it and saying, wait a second, you are making an argument against your own interest, and they just can't see that. Are you seeing any of the influence of either of those very strongly?
By crowdsourcing, do you mean the high-tech ways of aggregating opinion?
Yeah, just the basic concept of 100 people's can give us many more ideas than 2 people.
Most of my experience has been with the low-tech version of various kinds of hands-on interactive workshops, which I'm totally sold on in terms of their efficacy for getting over at least some of that polarization. Any community, there are certain polarizing people who are a kind of civic toxin. You know, they can spoil any meeting by just being nasty to people and being rude, and they can be managed, and there are ways to get over that. In fact, the high-tech polling techniques, has anybody ever used keypad polling in a big public meeting? I've just recently, in the past year, had the opportunity to have that technology and use it, and it's really great when you can pose questions to the crowd on the fly. People can anonymously vote people off the island, basically. I haven't ever done that. I've always fantasized about that. Like somebody's being real obnoxious, and you say, have we heard enough from Mr. Jones over here? That's question one, and yes. I've never quite, done that, but I've always fantasized about it.
Yeah, I've been part of various forms of charrettes for various groups, and one of the things that seems to always be essential is setting the groundwork, or sort of pre-visioning, where there's lots of imagery, certainly. There's lots of buzzwords. There's lots of slides of people as groups doing things that suggest community, things like that. That kind of set the table for a sense of, this desire that I do, in fact, want to be part of this, and I do want to own this. I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit more, because let's say it's been remarkable. I have to say the only downside that I believe inherently in it is that you pre-digest certain directions, and often the imagery can be controlled by those who are interested in what the outcome is, a preconception. So
the biggest difficulty in setting up an interactive public workshop is when I have to use professional planners as table facilitators. And I see this all the time in the training workshops that I do, where we're doing simulations, where I'm asking them to pretend to be a community group, and they cannot help themselves. Immediately they start talking like planners. They start using the buzzwords, and they start in with ideas that they know to be correct. Where what I'm trying to get them to see is that what you need is a process that leads the group to the conclusion that this is the problem and this is the kind of solution that you need, and therefore these planning ideas are relevant. That's the disconnect that you often see in public process, is that you'll have a public meeting, the planner will say, okay, what do you guys want to see? And people will articulate their desired outcomes in a variety of ways, and then the planners will promptly translate that into a set of solutions that they've already have in the can. And the connection is not always evident to people. Even if the planner is, in my mind, correct, people don't see the leap there. And so what I like to get them to work on doing in the hands-on workshops is to let people generate their own ideas without slotting them into these pre-boiled. And the new urbanists are often very guilty of this because they sell pretty hard. They have a history of selling the ideas pretty hard. And there's a lot of reaction against that in communities. The communities do not want to be feeling like they're being sold something because they don't trust that. So you really have to rein that in. And you know, when I train the table facilitators, I will insist that they remain absolutely neutral, that they cannot contribute anything to the conversation. Their only job is to document and really work with them on that and make them practice that, rather than automatically, you know, hog the pen. First of all, you make them give up the pen, and everyone else gets to write and draw. And so that means everybody gets to put things in their own damn words, rather than have the planner say, "Oh, I see. You want a 5-minute walk to the corner store." You know, they're jumping to the solutions before they figured out what the problem is. So I think a big part of it is learning actually to listen and to allow people the space to comfortably articulate. Now you need, when you do the educational stuff, there's this habit of giving lectures that load people up with concepts and ideas, and people will parrot those back, especially if they have a planner facilitating. They want to show that they did their homework, and that gets you into the same kind of thing. So I'm always leery of the sort of pre-charrette lecture type of education. I'm very careful about who I get to do those. I had a wonderful traffic engineer who nearly blew a workshop for me because he came in and started basically pitching the solutions before he really explained what the problems were that we were trying to solve. What we needed from the traffic engineer was an understanding of the real traffic conditions. We didn't need to know, you know, why skinny streets are good, or, you know, all the sort of planning solutions. And so everybody hated him. The developers hated him, the neighbors hated him. They thought he was arrogant and smarmy and pitching his, and he was not that way at all, but it was just a tactical mistake on his part. He didn't listen to me when I told him, don't do that. He did it anyway. So educational things like, let's go walking through the neighborhood with somebody that knows the architecture. So, and you know, people will learn, you know, say, oh yeah, that's interesting, that detail is very distinctive of our neighborhood. That's something, I've noticed that before, but I didn't know that's what it was called. Or we did an exercise in the Marigny neighborhood in New Orleans, which is very funky and weird and has all these irregularities to it, that you can actually derive some rules. So you can actually create a pattern such that if you wanted to build more of that, or if you wanted to repair it when it's ruined, you know that this is the pattern to reproduce. But at first, if you just look at it, you just think, well, this is a funky place. But you know, having neighbors walk through the neighborhood with experts who can say, well, this is what we call this, or notice how this setback works. Oh yeah, I've seen that, but I never really had the language to talk about it. So a little bit of technical jargon introduced in there, but only if you're careful not to, again, jump to solutions. You want to give people the ability to articulate problems and imagine outcomes that they like, but not just buy into the doctrine.
You know, you talked a lot about having to overcome the distrust of neighborhoods and local stakeholders in the charrette process. But I'd be interested in some of your comments of something that I think we as part of the Urban Design League have often had to deal with, which is having to overcome the distrust of the city government for opening up the process. The reality for the city government is a developer comes, the city government, most city governments in the past, at least in most of my adult years, have been strapped for cash. And a developer comes to them and what they see is money coming, they see taxes, they see jobs, and this is what the city needs. and they want to get this done as quickly and as, as quickly as possible. They don't want the developer to be scared off and disappear. And they know they have a process to go through. But often what governs that process is, let's not have a meeting where the outcome is uncertain. Let's go through the meetings, but let's make sure we know what the outcome is going to be. They see the really opening up the process, the really having a dialogue, as something that may very well end up in somehow scuttling the project, which is what they don't want. So how do you actually turn that around with city government to realize that there's actually a great deal to be learned? I mean, we had, as I'm sure you know, something we were very careful not to call even a mini charrette, but it was a workshop, and it had a great many of the elements that you are talking about. It was working very well. And on the second day of the workshop, one of the planners from the City Plan Department got up and said, I think I want people to understand what I do. I am given an assignment. I have to do it. I'm on deadline. I have to get it done. There's 7 people in this department, and we have, she enumerated all the different things they have to contend with at once. And I had a conversation with her afterwards, basically about the fact that, we all understand, we appreciate what they go through, but that's why we need a vision. Because very often developers who come, actually, as you mentioned in passing before, want to be a good guy. They want to add to it. But if the city doesn't have vision to present to the developer to say, this is what we're about, how can we get your project to fit into it? The developer has no guidelines or any reason to even think about the guideline. So I would actually, what I would like to hear is your thoughts about how do you change that very entrenched, for some very strong practical reasons, mindset of city governments?
I wish I had an answer for that. I'd be rich and famous if I could answer that question. There is a natural resistance to opening things up because of that fear that you're going to raise expectations, or that you're going to be in a position where you've heard them say that this is what they want, this is their interest, and you have to say no. If you're an elected official, you don't like to be in a position of having to say no to people too much. And the same thing, with the planning staff, I've always found that it's largely been a matter of lack of resources, and also concern that they're going to incite something that will make the project messier for the electeds. I had somebody from the county come to me, and she's been given the task of doing the public engagement piece required for a bicycle and pedestrian plan for the whole county. And here's the thing, is it's way overdue. They want it ready by September when the commission comes back from vacation. And guess what our budget is for public engagement? $300. It's like I couldn't believe it, $300. So what's she doing? She's doing an online survey. What do you want to see for bicycles and pedestrians in the county? Oh, that's going to be useful. And so with limited time and resources and no support behind her, she's stuck in this position where she's going through the motions, and she's going to engage people. They're going to get all worked up. Oh, this is what I'd like to see. This is what I'd like to see. And they're going to put it in there. And nothing that they say is going to have any connection to what comes out the other end, because the process is not designed so that there's any way to connect what people say to, what will happen is that the planners will come up with their bicycle and pedestrian plan, and anything that happens to show up in the surveys that echoes what they were going to do anyway, they'll say, well, here's what the people said, and look, we're doing it. And it won't really be a process where people will feel like, we said this, and here's the consequence of seeing that. That can be changed simply by redesigning that process of collecting that data, asking the question in a certain way so that people understand that we have this many degrees of freedom in what we can do. Here's a series of questions that we can ask you that will help us make a decision. And now that you've answered those questions, here's the decision we're going to make. So I helped her figure out a mapping project that she could do with stakeholders for no money that would ask the question more specifically to identify targeted interventions that could, because they're basically going to draw the map of pedestrian and bicycle facilities, not too different from the way it already is. But if they can say, well, we listened and here's what we did, then the process won't have been such a waste. So I think there's some of it's about learning tools in the staff position that you can do cheaply and easily, but changing the culture of the elected officials so that they're willing to open things up. Short of sending them all off to a re-education camp, I don't know. Leadership is a great thing to have. If you have a mayor that can change the discussion, but.
It occurs to me in the context of the question that you asked that, and tell me if you think this is right, is that, but by the time a developer is coming in to permit a certain project, it would be very difficult to sort of reshape it often. And part of the idea of initiating a series of charrettes is to sort of get ahead of the curve and try to put in place some sort of plan, some sort of form-based codes and things like that that sort of preempt those problems.
And in this conversation, at this level of abstraction, I'm keenly aware of the fact that I'm in New Haven, which has probably had a power structure more studied than any other town in the country. I mean, how many books have there been written about New Haven's government at this point? I think that's a challenging sort of thing, and I think it's a slow, difficult task of ultimately convincing elected officials that in the end, honest communication will pay off more than trying to spin the information carefully so that you minimize conflict. The one thing that the charrette leaders that I know who are really good have learned is that if there's an issue, if there's a problem in there, you do not try to hide it. You do not try to gloss over it. You confront it head on. You have to be honest about it and say, yes, we have this problem. We can't get enough density on this site without going higher than the 4 stories you guys told us was the drop-dead limit. That's the problem that we're facing. You've got to be honest about that. You can't try to be sneaky and gloss it over. Don't look over here where that tower is. It's behind the curtain. You have to address it straightforwardly. And in the end, that pays off. I'm convinced more often than not. But that's something that's difficult for people in public office to do, because you are always worrying about your message. You are always worrying about what the appearance is politically. I've worked very closely with city and county commissioners quite often, and I wouldn't have that job either. Public sector planners, or elected officials, because of that challenge of managing public information. I'm convinced, watching it done in different ways, that more communication and more information, actually, you trust the process will ultimately pay off. It may be painful in the short run, but I think, and just as a final thing also, I've noticed that more successful charrettes tend to happen in places where there have been successful charrettes in the past. There's a learning curve there. There's always a kind of, virgin experience. The first charrette, everybody always remembers that one, right? And that's this exciting moment. But they become more successful and effective the more people learn how to do it. That means the citizens, the elected officials. Often, the most frustrating things is the elected officials won't even come, because they want plausible deniability until they see what the outcome is going to be. Or they'll say, well, the attorney said we can't really come because of what we call the sunshine laws. They're called different things in different places. I've seen consultants who write their contracts, so they actually require that a certain number of the city council be front and center at a certain number of meetings, or they won't do the plan. That was in a different economy. Now, consultants no longer dictate that way, but I think that was a good idea. It's like none of this business of not showing up so that later you can say, well, I wasn't really connected with that. You know, you got. I think the electeds should be in it. That's my opinion anyway.
New Haven is a place that has a large healthcare economy with 2 hospitals and a medical school. And we also are a community that has a very strong environmental justice network organization. And we are an area that we have air quality air, is our environmental problems involve sores, hydrates, asthma. We have Robert Wood Johnson fellows here at Yale University that are involved in all kinds of community projects. One of our board members has been involved in community health surveys. And as you know, National Charrette Institute partnered with Robert Wood Johnson to create a charrette process to try to bring information about public health and put it into the design process. Have you ever participated in any of those charrettes, or do you have information about? I've seen the book on the website, and I've seen it mentioned, but I haven't heard much about it.
I haven't personally been involved with we get routinely public health people in the training workshops, and Bon Secours in particular has been sending people all the time. It's been an interesting phenomenon to watch. There's been a number of institutional players who've begun to realize some of the benefits of engaging communities differently. Hospitals are a big one, and public health people who were getting into community-based solutions to public health problems from a different angle are finding the charrette process a useful tool. And the other interesting institutional player is the Department of Defense has been all over us lately. They have an Office of Economic Adjustment. Talk about a great military euphemism. But what they're paying attention to is actually a good thing. You know, every time they close a base or relocate some major asset, they have a major impact on the local region. I mean, if they move a fighter wing from this base to that base, it's all this personnel, all those resources, all their families, they're loading up the roads, they're burdening the infrastructure, they need transportation, they need housing. They are potentially a huge economic boon to a region, but they have a history of going into places and letting the locals worry about themselves and not really paying attention. And suddenly they've realized, I think all the base closings was initially woke them up to this, as they began to consolidate assets in different bases. Now they are actually, there is, believe it or not, an Army guidance on how to do charrettes. And in typical Army fashion, you know, we talk metaphorically about how when you do a plan you want to get people to sign off, stakeholders to sign off on it. Well, the military took that absolutely literally. And so every participant in a military charrette has to literally sign off on this sheet. It's actually kind of amusing. And of course, you know, you can imagine where the problem, you know, is with military charrettes is that ultimately you have this extraordinarily hierarchical organization. So ultimately the base commander says, no, that's not what I want. I'm doing something different. And you know, so these consultants that do military charrettes are sort of going through the motions, getting people to sign off, and they're basically doing whatever the base commander says. But at least the impulse is there, the recognition is there that there could be different ways of engaging the stakeholders around you when you're having great impacts on communities. And I think hospitals have discovered that as well. Hospitals don't, you know, many places have a very bad name with the community because they have a kind of built-in manifest destiny, right? They expand a lot and eat into neighborhoods, and because they often see their mission as being so important, it overrides, in some cases, you know, other interests in their minds anyway. So the conflicts have often been not very productive. So I think it's great to see hospitals and hospital organizations and health organizations that bring enormous assets to many communities looking for ways to do that in a productive, collaborative fashion.
So a lot of us here are really interested in getting charrettes going in New Haven. And so a couple things that we've done are, as you're aware, this workshop we had last weekend, which I think was very successful. Of course, it's not a charrette, but I think it gave a lot of people a taste of what that process can be like. And then we're inviting you here to speak about this. Do you have any suggestions about sort of kind of the concrete steps for continuing to build a culture that's interested in doing this and trying to foster it? Sort of having the money to actually put one on ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most powerful learning experience is seeing a full-blown, well-run charrette work and being engaged in it. I have to confess, as a researcher, what happened to me was, after my first really dramatic, full-blown charrette in St. Michael's, Maryland, went back to my cheap motel where I was, staying on my research trip, and called my family and said, "That's it. I'm quitting my job. I'm going back to architecture school. I want to do that. It's so exciting." It's really intoxicating. It's easy to become a charrette junkie. But most importantly, I think what it does in a community is you begin, the community participants begin to have different expectations about what's possible. I've seen this happen in a lot of communities where the charrette leader, the first thing he has to do, and Andres Duany is very dramatic at this, charismatic. If the community is sort of whining about development but not willing to demand anything of the developer, he'll say, listen, you have all these assets. You don't have to go to the developer like a beggar and be afraid they're going to go away if you insult them. Tell them what you want. And that sense of empowerment on the part of the community, not only just to say what they want, but to articulate very clearly a shared vision. That's a dramatic thing to see. I've seen it in charrettes where at the beginning of the charrette, people are all sort of whiny and pathetic, and at the end, they're all excited that there's some important things that are possible that we never thought of before. We just thought we'd have to take what we were going to get. But now we realize that we can put our needs on the table and expect them to be met, at least considered in certain ways. And I think that it's sort of developing that sense of empowerment. And it's a matter of people actually learning how to work with the appropriate experts in order to articulate clearly. And ultimately, going back to the elected officials, I think this is what the elected officials like about a charrette that works, is that you get organized constituencies that can be very clear about what they want. The frustrating thing when you're sitting up there at that table and you're looking out at rooms full of angry people is that you'll hear one at a time they get up and they have their 3 minutes of rant. Do you guys do that in your city council meetings? I gave this talk in Canada, and the Canadians had no idea, or the Australians had no idea what I was talking about. They don't do that in Australia at all. 2-3 minutes, then the light goes off and the hook comes out. And so people get all nervous because what if I don't say it right or get it all in? And their voices are shaking, it's very intense, and using one after the other. People say things that are blatantly not true. No one calls them on it. No one corrects them. You have a mixture of the quasi-judicial ones are the most bizarre, where you have this mixture of expert testimony and neighbors who were saying, and this is going to kill my 90-year-old mother kind of argument. What do you do with that as an elected official when you're just listening to all this stuff and there's no way to process all these opinions because there's no discussion. It's just, a lot of information thrown at you in no organized way. And it doesn't have to be a charrette, but there are various ways that you can organize the voice of different constituencies so that you can make sense out of it. Most political scientists talk about how public opinion gets formed. We've lost some of those practices, I think, in terms of the discursive process of forming opinions collectively that has enough coherence that people can choose positions in a rationally justifiable way. I could go on all night, I promise you.
And obviously, we have an audience here that almost could too. But I think that we're.
County government was struggling with the fact that it was both property owner and regulator. And regulations from different angles, different departments. So they were just not the ones to be the conveners. So it really patience in your question.
We have some refreshments here. You can stay with us, talk a